Welcome to With All Due Respect. This is a podcast for women over 40 who are looking for sane, frank advice about their health and wellness, especially through and after menopause. I'm Amanda Thebe, a personal trainer and nutrition coach and the author of the best-selling book, Menopocalypse, How I Learned to Thrive During Menopause and How You Can Too. I'd love you to join me every week as I chew the fat with some fab guests on hot topics that directly impact you. I also know the power of conversation is lost, and there's nothing better than sitting down for a natter with your mate and putting the world to rights. And that's exactly what I'll be doing with this podcast. We'll really get to know my guests, warts and all. I've made it my mission to help you by exploding a few myths and presenting you with plain, simple facts. These inspiring conversations will hopefully empower you to be a healthy, strong, resilient bitch, just like me. Before we get started, don't forget to hit subscribe and leave a review, and then visit me at amandathebe.com. And now let's get started on today's show. Hi everyone, welcome back to With All Due Respect with me, Amanda Thebe, and today I'm speaking with Julie from Billingham. Oh my God! We think that's funny, and we'll tell you why in a minute. But Julie Liddell is actually from my neck of the woods. But Julie is a psychology educator and has been teaching psychology for 26 years. She started the Mindless Full 4 years ago as a way to bring psychology out of the classroom and into a more public space. And she runs workshops on stress through menopause and mindfulness, and has a particular interest in menopause from a personal perspective. And I've collaborated with Julie a couple of times. Julie is part of the NAYA project that we're doing, and she's offered the most amazing workshop of courses that you can learn how to, declutter your mind and de-stress. It's amazing. But anyway, let's just bring this back to the beginning. First of all, hello, Julie.
Hi, Amanda. Lovely to be here.
So everyone's going to realize that we talk the same, and we talk the same because we're from the same small town in the northeast of England, but we never knew each other growing up, even though we're, I think, the same age. I'm a tiny bit older than you, but what's a few years between friends? How did you find me? How do we know each other? What's the whole Billingham connection? And by the way, Google that, Billingham. There's some fun facts about Billingham. You'll see Chumbawamba is from there. I get knocked down. But how did we meet you?
We're not going to sing, Amanda. So a friend of mine, we had a WhatsApp group, me and my friends, and we talk a lot about menopause. And a friend kind of dropped a link. You were a guest on a podcast. It wasn't your podcast, it was somebody else's. And she dropped the link and she said, have a listen, everyone, have a listen, girls. She said, you really relate to this woman who's talking. She's really good. And I kind of had a listen, and I got about halfway through and I thought, she's not from Texas, because I think at the time you were living in Texas, weren't you? You were in America.
Yeah.
And I thought, she sounds a bit too northern. So I Googled you, and sure enough, it said, Amanda Thebe from the Northeast. And before the podcast had even finished, I'd found your email address, hadn't I? And I dropped you a line, and I recognised your surname because I'd gone who turned out to be your brother. And I just dropped you a line, and I just felt like we were on the same page. I loved the way you spoke about menopause. I loved the way you spoke about, lifestyle changes that you could make. And so I dropped you that email, didn't I? And said, just a little line from Billingham. And I think you pinged back within about 5 minutes.
It wasn't a little line. It was like a frigging dissertation.
10-page monologue. Yeah, I only do.
But it's so funny because my name is fairly unusual. I actually don't know any other Thebes. I mean, apart from my own family, it's not a common name. And so, so clearly with my brother. My brother's like, oh yeah, I know Julie. They support Hartlepool United. There's another small fact, nobody supports Hartlepool United, but her family are hardcore. My family are hardcore. Anyway, but what was really great is when I read your email and you said you were from Billingham, I asked Christian, and he was like, yeah, I totally know her and some of her friends. And so I reached out to you because I actually liked the 10-page monologue that you sent me. We very much are aligned. So let's be a little bit more serious, Julie. So messing around, let's just talk serious stuff now. We do literally talk the same way, have the same vision. And I think, I don't know what you reckon. Like, you've obviously got all of this education that you bring from a classroom setting. And I bring, my personal training, nutrition stuff. But I think there's maybe a big element of feeling and pragmatic attitude towards this. You don't mess around when you're from the Northeast, do you?
No, definitely not. Definitely not. And I think, we had very similar backgrounds and we weren't educated in any of this. We weren't kind of taught how to look after ourselves. And I don't even remember being taught how to look after myself physically, particularly, in terms of diet and, what to eat and drink, let alone that we had minds that need looking after as well. And I think where you and I are on the same page is we're kind of big believers that everybody should know this stuff. We should all just know and understand how to look after ourselves and those little things that we can do just to, improve our well-being and, your stance from a nutrition and a physical point of view. But I do think that we approach it in very much the same way, which is very down to earth and very much kind of, you just kind of try this, give it a go. And
yeah, give it a go, give it a shot, because that's essentially what it's like, lived experience plus education. And we're just trying to say to women, it doesn't need to be complicated. Let's just show you what we know works actually factually, without trying to do all of this, the finite micromanagement that ever seems to be thrown at us. I mean, I feel like women get really confused because they get thrown all of this information. And we're saying, think about moving some of the big rocks before you start getting down to that nitty gritty detail. Because often when you start making the changes that we talk about all the time, there's a huge cascading effect, right? And so for you, Julie, so you're an educator, so you're literally in the classroom teaching psychology, right? So how did you make the sort of move from being in the classroom setting, teaching people, how they're going to work in psychology, to then thinking, there's a gap here, women are not being served in this area? What was the bridge for you there?
I think there was a seed that was set from my students years ago, and they always used to say to me, why don't we know any of this? How do we get to, I taught adults originally, and then I moved into post-16 education, and they used to say, why don't we know this? Why don't we understand, or why aren't we taught any of this information? So the seed was sort of set years and years ago. But then for me, I think it was about 2016, but it was 2016. And so I was 43. So in hindsight, obviously perimenopausal. A lot went on for me physically. I had a lot of things changed all at once. And obviously, as we now know, they were perimenopausal symptoms. But I also developed an autoimmune condition. I developed inflammatory arthritis on my big fat knee, as I like to call it. And my knee swelled up to the point where I couldn't actually get up the stairs. So just walking and bending my knee was really, really difficult. So there was kind of a physical manifestation of perimenopause, but as it turned out, kind of a lot of stressful symptoms as well. And I don't think I would never have identified as stress. I was just really busy, that women in the way that women in midlife really are. So I had my career, I was in a management position, kind of safeguarding lead, lots going on at work, my 2 children, the dog, life. And, as I say, I didn't feel like I was stressed, but clearly I just began wearing my stress. The migraines kind of ratcheted up, and I really was not in a good place physically at all. And there was a restructure going on at work, so I decided just to step back my hours a little bit and take a little bit of time just to try and get well, really. And that involved a lot of mopping the floor to begin with. I didn't really know what to do with myself, and just spending a little bit of time kind of, starting a yoga class again, trying to look after myself. Now, I always knew about mindfulness, which I'm sure we'll get onto in a few minutes, but I signed up for an 8-week mindfulness course, and that for me was such a game changer. And I thought, do you know what? I want to tell people about this. I want to tell people about where I've been and what mindfulness, amongst other things, has done for me. And I've continued to develop my mindful practice. And then I was lying there in a yoga class, and actually the name, The Mindless Full, came to me. And I thought, that's it. I want to go out there, I want to get into the community, and I want to start talking to people. And so that's what I did. And I set up a Facebook page and I ran my first little class in the post office, a little room above the post office. And I got 15 women came along and I did my first ever session. And then it's just grown from there.
Right. And it was clear to you when you did that session, right, that you were like, wow, like this is a game changer for women, right? And I did an online session with you too. It was one Sunday morning. It was so great. We had a ton of women there and we went through a whole workshop with them. And the feedback was amazing because as women, I don't think we give ourselves the opportunity or like even the time to pause and just go, what is it I need right now? What is it I personally need? Because we're so conditioned to care for everybody else and not ourselves, right? That for me personally, I had to stop caring for everyone else because my quality of life, like yours, was impacted to the point where I couldn't function. I couldn't function at all. I needed to just pull it back and look after myself. And I wrote one of the chapters in my book is called Shift Happens, which is a really funny title, Julie. You're allowed to laugh right there because I think it's funny, but it was like a game changer. But it was a game changer for me because I just realized how important it was for me to sort of, I hate the words like intention and all, manifestation and all. I just don't like using those words. I just don't know why. But essentially, that's what I did. I started getting up a little bit earlier in the morning, having a coffee and just being really quiet and thinking and planning my day and reducing my 20 things on my to-do list to the 3 most important things and looking for wins whenever I could. And it just started to all fall into place. And there was no formal practice for me, but there was definitely an awareness change and it stuck with me to this time. But what you did is you ended up evolving like the workshop to like the Mind Less Full. It's like a full program for women to do right now. And so can you talk us through what you help women with? Like, where do we start? How do you even have the conversation, I suppose?
Yeah, I just want to go back to something you were saying there, Amanda, and just about as women, that kind of that space to allow yourself that time, and I think that's so true. The sociologists call it the triple shift or the triple burden, that as women, we often have work, paid work and career work, and then we have domestic work, but then we also have this kind of emotional role as well, where we carry a lot of people's, emotional burden. So you often carry the emotional weight of your friends and the family. And as a result of that emotional energy that you're usually giving to other people, you end up with very little emotional energy left for yourself, and we talk about self-care and we talk about all of this sort of stuff, but really that's what we're talking about, that women, particularly in midlife, end up with very little space left for themselves. And so for me in my workshops, it's very much about just saying, let's just have 2 hours. Let's kind of give yourself that time, because to me, that 2 hours of investing in yourself is, I know a haircut's lovely and I know going and getting your nails done and all of that makes you feel good, but actually some time investing and learning about the way your mind works and the way that we can work with our mind rather than letting our mind work against us is, can be really, really powerful. And I know a lot of women who've been to my workshops have said that they've just taken 1 or 2 things and it stayed with them. And they practice it every day, so just, taking a couple of things away from the workshop.
Which sort of like confirms it doesn't need to be complicated, does it? Like it doesn't.
Absolutely not. No, absolutely not. But when I run my workshops, I start with a focus on stress, because stress plays such a role for women in midlife, as we've already talked about. I think women in midlife find themselves, it's a bit of a Venn diagram, isn't it? They end up in the muddled, with life stresses and with physical stresses. There's so much going on during, midlife that stress is just a key feature. And it's not just women in midlife who are stressed, obviously, but I do think that stress ratchets it up. And I know in your book you do a whole chapter, don't you, on stress?
I do, and I think it has a valid place in it. One, because of the link with cortisol and estrogen, of course, how that is impacted. Well, mainly as estrogen falls, we see like the stress response change, but I think you've just nailed it. It's that triple threat, whatever you called it, triple burden.
Yeah.
So lots of people have those things. It becomes more pronounced when it's in midlife because, we see our aging parents and teenagers, we're stuck in that sandwich generation as well, essentially, but have that compounded by life-altering menopause symptoms. It's like this big bag of like, fucking hell, what's happening to me? And probably the last place that someone's going to go to when they're feeling so overwhelmed is, oh, I better go and do some mindfulness, because it doesn't seem appropriate, right? But what we're actually saying is, guess what? It really is appropriate.
Yeah, and I think that's why I always start with stress management to begin with, because I think stress management is more, people identify with that more and are going to be more attracted to that element than, as you say, the more fluffy mindfulness, which, you and I know makes people roll their eyes out loud, you included, Amanda.
Yeah.
But I'm an educator, and I believe if you understand how things work, and to me, making sure people understand what stress is and how it impacts on your body, then when it comes to explaining mindfulness, it kind of makes a bit more sense. So I do think that education around stress is super important, and as we know in menopause, stress actually in high cortisol levels produce many of the symptoms that are similar to those that you experience in menopause as well. So, all sorts of things, affect sleep, energy, mood, fatigue, all of those things can be caused by high cortisol, or that can exacerbate those symptoms of menopause. So
it's all connected, for sure.
Oh, yeah. And reducing cortisol and stress to me should be, the key focus every single day.
Absolutely. And so you explain what stress is, and you talk about it as a stress bucket. I love the stress bucket. Talk about what that is.
Yeah, so it's just getting people to imagine that stress is a bucket that they carry around with them, and thinking about everything that goes into that bucket during the day. Because I think also as women, we are, we can be quite dismissive, can't we? And we just think, no, we're just busy and everybody's busy and I just need to kind of crack on. But actually, if you just spend some time thinking about that and looking at maybe the major life stresses, any kind of physical changes or menopausal symptoms, and any micro stresses as well, those little things on a daily basis. And when you just spend 5 or 10 minutes thinking about what is flowing into your bucket, it tends to kind of make you a little bit more compassionate. And I find that when you're acting from a place of compassion, then you are more likely to take the time to think, right, I do need to do something to invest in my well-being. So then we also look at how that kind of impacts and the stress reactions in a physical and an emotional and a behavioural way, because stress leaks out of us, doesn't it? You might find yourself snapping at people. I remember on my workshop you talked about how, was it your husband, the way he ate his yoghurt?
I was going to say, can we talk about micro stresses? I was going to say, is that like yogurt? Is that like him eating his yogurt? Yeah. I'm still not compassionate about that, though. I have to say, I'm compassionate to myself about that because it's so stressful. For anyone listening, he eats his yogurt with a spoon and then he flips the spoon over in his mouth and then he pulls it out and down. Every spoonful. He like has an upside down spoon in his mouth and it's almost like he's savoring the taste and like licking the spoon. And I just want to stab him with that spoon. It's so stressful to watch. Yeah. But anyway, so I refuse to be compassionate about that because he's just got to stop doing it and use the spoon in the manner in which it was created. Goodness sake. So, identification of our stresses seriously it is really key, right? And we've all experienced those moments, hey, Julie, where we've just lost our crap on something and it didn't seem like we were in control when we're doing it. I found that over the years, that's really calmed down almost to a point where I'm almost not bothered enough about stuff anymore. Like, it's so funny. I mean, I know that that's the changes in our just lives going through perimenopause to postmenopause. I see a lot of calming down in lots of ways, and the small stuff doesn't stress us as much. The spoon and the yogurt still does, but like some of the things that used to really grind my gears, I'm just like, whatever. And I see that that's happening. So if we can help women manage their stresses through the turbulent years of perimenopause, it really sets you up for a lot of success post-menopause, right? So, we've done the stress bucket. We've identified these big stresses, the micro stresses. It's given us an element of compassion that allows us to maybe react differently in a situation, also to be kinder to ourselves, because compassion goes all around, right? And that's when we need to start doing things to sort of cement that in place, right? To change the way our brain functions. And what's so cool about mindfulness is we've seen on MRI scans, it literally changes the shape of our brain. It's very cool. So I know I joke about it, but I truly do understand the power of it. So let's talk about mindfulness, what it is and what it isn't.
Yeah. So obviously our brains are neuroplastic, as you just said. And in the same way, we can kind of tread a pathway in our brains to be reactive and stressed, because that's kind of what we end up doing. The more stressed we get, the more stressed we become and the more vigilant to stresses around us. And that can make us really reactive. So in the same way, we can train our brains to dial that back down and to respond instead of react, so that we can kind of essentially mindfulness, I always call it ordinary magic, because mindfulness is something that we possess already. It's a tool and it's an awareness tool, and it's basically training yourself to be aware of the present moment. And when we're aware of the present moment, we're not caught up in kind of rumination about the past or worry about the future, or caught up in that big emotional reaction that we might find ourselves in. So if we teach ourselves and we practice being mindful, we're practicing, being able to bring ourselves into the present moment, so that when we find ourselves in the rumination or the worry about the future or the big emotions, rather than kind of dive into them, it gives us that chance to kind of pause and step out of them. And that's really what we're training ourselves to do when we're training in mindfulness. So I often liken it to kind of going and doing exercise in the gym in the same way that you'd go and you'd strengthen a muscle. When we're mindful, when we're doing mindfulness training, we're strengthening our awareness muscle. And the more that we strengthen it, then, as I say, when it comes to those kind of meltdown periods or those overwhelm, or when we want to chuck our stress all over our husband for the way that he eats his yogurt, rather than just reacting like that, mindfulness allows us to bring ourselves back into the present moment, and not caught up in all of that other stuff.
One of the biggest, I was just going to add on to that, Julie, and maybe you can respond. One of the biggest symptoms of perimenopause that I get taught, as well as like the physical, like the vasomotor symptoms, hot flashes, is anxiety. Yeah. And it comes out of nowhere. And we know that progesterone is like a really calming hormone. And when we start to lose that, it can sort of exacerbate anxiety that maybe was already existing, or bring on anxiety for women that have never had it before. Happens at night. It's so stressful. And they just go there. It doesn't have to make sense. Perceived and threats or that type of those really anxious moments don't have to make a lot of sense at all, right? How does mindfulness sort of like help with that? I mean, you've obviously said like it brings you back to the present, but sort of like, how does it help with that? And then how does that look? Maybe talk about that. Like, so if I'm waking up at 2 in the middle of the night, like really anxious that I'm not going to get back to sleep because it's going to cascade and ruin my day, how does mindfulness play?
Yeah, so what you're talking about there is your future worries, and they're often the things that are making us feel anxious. So if we're worried about not sleeping because we've got a big meeting the next day, we're kind of forward thinking. So practicing mindfulness, the more we practice it, the easier it is to do. And you can practice mindfulness in so many different ways. And it goes back to that strength training. If you can do it every day, then the easier it's going to be at 2:00 in the morning to be able to bring yourself back to the present. So there's so many ways that you can practice mindfulness, so many ways. So
some of your favourites then. Talk about some of your favourites.
Well, basically, we can do formal training and we could do informal training. So your formal training is the meditation. And I think this is the bit that puts a lot of people off, to be honest. And I've done meditation on and off all my life. I've decided I was going to be a Buddhist in my early 20s and went on a retreat and did some meditation that way. And I've done meditation at yoga. But mindfulness meditation is slightly different to those types of meditation. So in mindfulness meditation, what we're practicing is we're using the breath to keep ourselves present, because the first thing that you want to do when you sit down to meditate is you start feeling uncomfortable and you're itchy and you start thinking of all the things that you've got to do. And in mindfulness meditation, we're just using the breath to keep ourselves in the present moment. And obviously, the more you do that, the easier it becomes, so that when you wake up at 2 o'clock in the morning, you can use the breath because it's constant and it's ever there. And you can focus on your breathing and do some mindful breathing to, reduce that anxiety and bring yourself back into the present, rather than, thinking about 9 o'clock in the morning and the meeting that you've got to go to. So, the meditation is fantastic. But then I think the informal ways of practicing mindfulness tend to be the ones that, I found these the most effective to begin with. And I know these are the sorts of things that you incorporated as well, aren't they? So that's the things like savouring. It's the having your first sip of coffee on a morning. And instead of having your coffee when you're, watching the telly, catching up on your emails, packing the kids' lunches, you just focus on the coffee. And if you just focus on the coffee, that's the mindfulness training. That's the practicing the present moment. And you can do that with anything. You can do it when you're driving. You can do it when you're out for a walk. But all you're doing is you're honing that skill. You're honing that skill of being present. And certainly they were the things that worked best for me in the early days when I was practicing. And that I still do every single day now, as part of my mind.
I think that a lot of women really like the informal practice because it feels more doable.
Yeah.
When you're doing like a meditation session, it can feel overwhelming, although there are some great apps out there like the Dan Harris stuff, and there's some really great meditation apps. If people, I actually didn't enjoy them. I tried to do those and didn't enjoy them, but after the workshop you did, I always did my coffee thing. When I started to need to have that time to myself, the coffee thing just worked for me. But then I incorporated one of your, just being really mindful of sounds around me. Being outside in nature is like the best for me. It's like the best thing. And so going for a walk, and instead of letting my mind go crazy and worry about all the things I had to do, I just literally walked away from it and then would listen to the birds. And then if my mind wandered again, go back to the sounds. What can I hear? And that's the only thing I would focus on. And I think that was one of your techniques that you suggested. Yeah.
Yeah, so tuning into your senses. So we can use the breath in mindfulness, or we can use any of our senses. So whether that's sight or sound or touch. Lots of people that I've worked with like just having a scarf, and we're going into the winter months here in the UK, just having something tactile that they can just rub or feel that they like the feel of. So it can be anything, that literally brings you back to your senses, because if you're back in your senses, you're back in the present moment. Your mind's not running either backwards or forwards. You're in the present moment. And that can be incredibly. So, there's tons of little tiny things like that can be done.
Yeah. And so I think it's so great. And I just want to sort of end with the breathing, because I talk a lot about this in my book and I know how powerful it is. And I understand the physiology behind it as well. And, a lot of us, not just women, a lot of humans, especially adults in the workplace as well, tend to be real shallow breathers, like chest breathers. And we don't really take a deep breath in. And when you try to get someone to take deep breaths, it's really hard for them to do. And so I know that I love doing those big Buddha breaths, I call them, so I put my hands on my belly and I fill my belly with loads of air. I think a lot of women don't like doing that because we've been literally trained to keep our bellies in tight, right? It's ridiculous. Keep your tummies in, yeah. But when we do these big deep breaths, how it can elicit that parasympathetic nervous system, and it literally can change us. Doing some big deep breathing changes from being in a fight or flight mode to calm present mode. And so I think that I would just say to anyone listening, don't underestimate the power of breathing. It literally is the thing that can take you from up high to bringing you back down.
Yeah, there's a great book, James Nestor, called Breathe. And he talks a lot about the exhale being longer than the inhale. And so if you don't like doing the big kind of Buddha breaths, then that's just a really easy technique. If you just, when you do your inhale, count for sort of 3, hold it for 4, and then exhale for 5. So the out breath, and that can be really, really calming. And just a minute of that breathing can be really powerful.
Every day. Yeah, every day you do that. And then you're done. That's you. You've done it. You've nailed it. You can tick that great big box. If you know how we like to tick our boxes, that's my thing. I am like literally sat talking to Julie with a list, and I'm going to tick the box when we finish recording this. It's so funny. Okay, listen. So coming to the end of our time, 2 things I'd like you to share. First of all, where can we find you? Because I would love more women to know about your work. I think it's a game changer, and I just would love people to sort of like come over, find your workshops, find your website, your Instagram page, your social media, and then leave us with some good old solid billing and practical advice. Give us some words of wisdom, Julie.
Okay, so I'm on social media, on Facebook, on Instagram at The Mind Less Full. I've also got a webpage, which is mindlessfull.co.uk. So you can find me over there. As for my good old solid wisdom, Billingham wisdom, the place where concrete came to die, just say, and it is a bit of a cliche, but knowledge is power. And whatever you can do to educate yourself around ways to manage stress, do that. And if you feel inclined, explore a bit of mindfulness as well. And you don't need any bells or whistles or cushions or harem pants unless you really want them. Mindfulness can be practiced by everyone, and it just might make a difference.
It just might. I think it will. Shift happens. It really does. Thanks, Julie. It's so great to chat with you. I think I become more Billingham when I talk to people back from back home. I think this episode I might sound really northern. I don't know.
People are going to be listening to this, aren't they, and thinking, yeah, I don't understand what they're talking about. Our accents are heavier, I think.
I think so. I think I've changed from having like a Billingham accent to more of a Geordie accent, if anyone understands what I've just said then. But it's changed just because I've not lived at home for 3 years now. Anyway, listen, thanks, Julie. Really great for you to come on. Thank you for the work you've done with Naya as well. People are going to absolutely love it. Yeah. And just keep putting out some great content. Thank you very much indeed.
It's a pleasure. Thanks, Amanda.
Bye, everyone.
Thank you so much for listening to the show. If you like what you hear, then why not subscribe to this podcast and leave me a review? You see, when you do this, it helps to raise the profile of my show and attract new listeners. And it also allows me to continue to deliver valuable content with great guests. And in return for you doing that, I will send you my 12-week core-focused program called Abs on Fire as a thank you. Simply drop me an email at amanda@amandasteve.com and I'll wing that your way. Bye.